Now we're here at the command station inside the golf lab, and we're going to go through and use the K-Coach software to analyze the rotations and kinematic sequence, and we're going to use the gears software to look at some translations and probably a little more kinematic sequence. So what I've got up here on the video wall behind me is an example that comes with the K-Coach software of an efficient kinematic sequence, sort of the model of efficiency. So let's start to work our way through this graph and make sure that we understand what we're looking at. Now, the first thing here is we go up and down the vertical axis, the y-axis. Remember, this is showing us rotational speed measured in degrees per second. And across the bottom here, this is showing us time. Our zero mark, this is no rotation. Right? So that's before things even start moving. The swing is triggered to start when the sensors in the KVS identify that movement is happening. And as we see that these curves start to work down, that's a negative rotational speed in relation to the target. So as these are working down, that means that that particular segment is rotating away from the target. Now here, even as they're starting to come back up towards zero, if it is below this equator, if it's below this zero line here, that means it's still negative rotation or rotation away from the target. It's not rotation to the target until it breaks this equator and starts to ramp up again. As it's coming here upwards towards, that's a slower negative rotation. So we can see here, if we look at a 140 milliseconds, we have a very slow, maybe only 30 degrees per second negative rotation of the pelvis. But when we take a look down here at the same time code, we have a negative rotation of the club. That speed is probably close to 500 degrees per second moving backwards away from the target. The last thing that we want to understand when we look here is that the slope of these graphs determines the acceleration. So if we look at the slope here on the pelvis graph, that rise over run, there's not a lot of acceleration, okay? So it's not changing speed very quickly. If we look down here, we can see that there's a lot more negative acceleration of the club as it rotates back away from the target. And as we look through here, when we see a segment like this with the pelvis that has a lower slope, that's a lower rate of acceleration, say over here where we see a very steep slope for the lead arm. Now let's start to work through our process for kinematic sequence analysis here at the Golf Lab. At most places, they will always start with the peak speed sequence, but here at the lab, we really like to start with the transition sequence. And the reason that we start there is when we take a look at the database of elite golfers, PGA, LPGA tour players that we have both here, but also at places like TPI and Phil Cheatham's database, the most common trait we see in the kinematic sequence occurs in transition. So if we see the highest percentage of elite players exhibiting this characteristic, we think that's a really good place to start. And that specific characteristic that I'm talking about is the first thing we see in the downswing. The first thing to rotate towards the target is the lower body. And if we take a look down here, we've got a graph of one of our members. So what I'd like to do is we've gone through, we've captured it. Even without analyzing it, we can see his peak speed sequence is quite nice, but I can use the wheel on my mouse to zoom in here and start to take a look at transition sequence, the change in direction. This is how the golfer is putting energy into the system, how they generate their power. And now I can see here that absolutely that red line, and on K-Coach, that's the pelvis, is beginning the downswing. It's rotating first towards the target. I like that. For me, that's almost a non-starter. I can't recall ever seeing an elite golfer that starts the downswing with something other than their lower body. Then as we go in, we take a look at what starts to happen next. Well, you know what? It looks like right here, the next thing to go is actually the arm and the club. And then the last thing to go would be the torso. So that's what it is. Let's compare it to this elite sequence. Now as we look in here, we see again that lower body goes first. We see a pretty good gap, but now we see that proximal to distal pattern that is a real hallmark of efficiency. This is how to get the most power in with the least amount of effort. So we see the upper body goes second, we see the arm goes third, and we see the club comes out last. Now, I think it's important to understand that all the 3D systems out there, they define the top of the backswing by that moment in time in which the club changes direction. The next thing we want to talk about as it pertains to transition sequence is going to be the 3 types of patterns that we'll see. The first one, we'll take a look here on this particular graph. I'm actually going to eliminate the arm and I'm going to eliminate the club, so I've only got the pelvis and the upper body here. Now, anytime we see this proximal segment rotating faster or above the distal segment, that's called loading. And that's when we get into an eccentric muscle contraction, which is actually going to help us generate the most possible power. So if we look at all the way from, right here, when the pelvis starts to change direction, and all the way through midway into the downswing right here, at all points in time, that pelvis is rotating faster towards the target than the upper body. So that's what's creating that eccentric or elongating contraction of the muscle, which is the most powerful. Now let's go ahead and let's find someone that exhibits the next pattern, riding. Now we've got another golfer up here, so let's take a look at their transition sequence, and then we'll take a look at that second pattern that we often see called riding. So once again, I'm going to zoom in here and let's see what we've got. So red goes first in the K-coach world. That means the pelvis is going. Again, as we said, that's a non-starter for us here at the lab. We like that. Next thing to go blue is the arm, and then let's see, gosh, we've got, we kind of got the club and the upper body going together. So that is what it is. We know that differs from the elite sequence, but let me take away, in this case, the pelvis, and let me take away the club. Now this right here, I think, provides a great example of riding, or that isometric contraction. So right here, we've got our golfer's upper body, and we've got their arm, and they are rotating towards the target at approximately the same speed for a long, long time. We really see those things locked together. And again, depending on the muscle composition of your golfer, whether they still maintain that elasticity or whether they've stiffened up a little bit, it's actually possible that the muscles will generate more force when they stay kind of locked together instead of getting over separated. But right here, perfect example of riding. So now we're going to find one more golfer so we can take a look at our last, and I'll say, unless you're chipping, the least desirable type of pattern we see in 3D transition. Now we've got our third golfer loaded up, and let's go ahead and first look at transition sequence and then start to take a look and see if we can identify this fanning pattern. Now we go in through here, we do see actually here that the upper body fires minutely before, it starts to rotate towards the target minutely before the lower body. If I zoom back out, that's pretty close to riding. I would definitely like to see those inverted, but it's not a huge flag on the play, but definitely something I would take a look at. Then as we go down through here, we see the golfer's arm go next, then the club go next. So not great, but not too bad. Now, if we're going to take a look for that next pattern, I'm going to eliminate the pelvis, and let's eliminate the, well, gosh, we could do either one. Let's eliminate the upper body first, and we go in right here. So we see right in here just a tiny bit of loading through transition, but very quickly this gets into fanning. So fanning is where the club, in this case, is going to be going faster, rotating faster towards the target than the arm. That puts those muscles into the concentric contraction where they're shortening, which, as we talked about, generates the least amount of power. And in this particular case, if I eliminate the club and I get down here, I also see another fanning pattern exhibited by that golfer's arm really getting out and moving faster than the upper body. So here we've got fanning of the arm and fanning of the club. So again, unless you're working on short game where we want to rob the golfer of efficiency, allowing them to make big movements with very little power delivered to the ball, this is a very undesirable pattern and is going to cost your golfers a significant opportunity to generate speed with minimal effort. here at the Golf Lab, after we've gone through and taken a look at transition sequence, and specifically just making sure that that lower body is starting the rotation towards the target, the next thing that we want to understand is the peak speed sequence. You know, or right here, what order do these peak speeds occur in? And for us, that really helps us understand the signature of how the golfer releases energy down to the golf ball, out to the club head. We like to think of this transition sequence as how they put power in, and this is how they get power out. Now, the traditional model that we've been trained under and we see that is definitely the ideal model for efficiency is to have this proximal to distal sequence that you see exhibited here in our first member, where it goes from the pelvis to the upper body to the arm and on out to the club. And if we pull up this elite example, again, we see this same pattern happening here, okay? And this is what really allows us to have get the, just that most rapid building of rotational speed, maximum energy transfer from one segment to the next. Interestingly enough, when we pour through our PGA Tour database and we look at a lot of the younger players, we see a little bit of a shift in this sequence. And what we see is actually where the upper arm from the sensor here is going to stabilize well before the torso. So we know that this segment is triggered to stabilize when the club starts to go. So we believe that that's from some modern instruction beliefs where we want to see people get the left arm out in front of the body, keep the club in front of the body, have the club exit left, and that can be really effective for minimizing a player's closure rate. So we believe now that there's two ideal kinematic sequences. This one behind me is representing the ideal efficiency, or how to get the most amount of club head speed with the least amount of effort. And this alternative sequence that we're seeing come up more and more, we believe is an ideal one for controlling the golf ball in the full swing. And a lot of the young athletes on tour have been so well developed that they can even move in that way, rob themselves of some speed, but still generate 120 miles an hour club head speed, a little bit less closure rate, and keep a little bit tighter dispersion of their golf ball. Now here's our second golfer, and as we go, we start to take a look at their peak speed sequence. We can see that it's kind of a little bit all over the place, and I think this is a pretty good descriptor as to how this player really struggles with consistency, not just from day to day, but from shot to shot, even hole to hole. So in fact, one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to go through, I'm even just going to grab another one of his 6-iron swings and see if we see variance within that. Yeah, so we see similar pelvis timing, similar torso timing, but big difference in when those when the upper arm stabilized. So we go back to this one here. We can see this one's kind of all over the map. And this is going to make it very, very difficult for our player to consistently release energy down to the club head, square the club face, and ultimately find their golf ball and make clean contact. Now here's again that kinematic sequence from our third golfer. And if you remember, while this guy's a good player, he exhibits that fanning pattern that you can see again behind me in transition and really robs him of a lot of speed. He's a former professional hockey player, doesn't have much club head speed, but he is quite consistent. And if we go here, we see there's just a slight difference in the timing, ever so slightly out of sequence. But if we look at swing over swing, we do see this quite consistent. And he does have very low closure rate, and he does have very good control over his golf ball. It just is a real struggle for him to be able to hit it more than 220 yards. Say, unlike that last player who had a more ideal transition sequence, and when he syncs it up, he's able to easily hit his driver 270 to 280 yards. But that scatteredness in the previous player's deceleration sequence, peak speed sequence, is what really prevents him from being able to repeat that same shot over and over and over. So again, remember, when we're taking a look at decel sequence, first thing, consistency is the key, and we see two primary patterns. The proximal to distal pattern represents maximizing speed while still having the opportunity for consistency. And what we see from a new breed of tour player is altering that sequence a little bit to reduce the closure rate, rob them of a little bit of speed, but ultimately give them a chance to find more fairways and keep the ball more online. The third spot that we take a look at when we're analyzing kinematic sequence is what I would consider like a level 2 detail on transition sequence, and it's specifically about segmental loading. So now that we understand a little bit about the difference in the way the muscles work and contract with segmental loading and how that affects power, let's take a look at some of these graphs so we can see it kind of live in action. So here's our first player, low handicap, even though he doesn't get a chance to play that much. So let's look at it one at a time. So the first thing I'm going to do is I am going to remove the arm and the club, and we go in here, and yes, we can see all this time where that lower body, pelvis, is rotating faster than the upper body. So this entire area in here represents the amount that that player loads the core. That's the most efficient way to get power from the muscles of the core link. Now, what we're going to do is let's take off the pelvis and put the arm back in. So now if we take a look here, we actually see there is no, a little bit in there, but there's no real point in time where that arm is going to be lagging behind the upper body. In fact, here, right early in transition, we can see that's even a little bit of fanning, right, where that arm gets out in front of the body. So definitely, if this player was really focused on having some power, we know we've got one opportunity to help them learn how to load that shoulder link, how to get the upper body rotating towards the target faster than the arm and suck a little bit more power here out of that lead shoulder. So for the last bit, let's take out the take out the torso, leave the arm in, and let's put the club back in. Okay, now right here in transition, we see we get a little bit of load between the shoulder and the club. And then as we go back up, we see a little bit more of a reload here, partway through the downswing. So, I'd say that's a good moderate amount of load in here between the elbow, wrist to the club. We could see a little bit more if we needed to, but you know what, I'd be very happy with that pattern. So with this golfer, we know they're getting a significant amount of power from the core, they're getting a little bit here from the wrist link, and they've got a real opportunity to develop some at the shoulder link. Let's go ahead and take a look at our second player. Now we've got our second player up that we're analyzing. And if you remember when we're looking at the peak speed sequence, and this player really struggles with consistency, we see that that's a little bit all over, but at the same time, they get some pretty good speed. And when they sync it up, they get pretty darn good distance. So let's see how they do that. First thing, again, I'm gonna take off the arm, take off the club. Let's see what's going on at the core link. Well, I'll tell you, that's pretty nice right there. I see the pelvis breakout first, just like we always want to see, and they're maintaining a good bit of separation through here. So yeah, that's a pretty good stretch of the core. They're getting some good power there. So let's take off the pelvis and let's add the arm back in. Okay, now again here, there's not really any loading of the torso. It's like they almost kind of reload something down in here. It looks a little bit messy, so definitely an opportunity to generate a little bit more speed from this shoulder link. Now let's get rid of the torso. Let's throw in the club. Yeah, and this is what I expected here. Again, I've worked with this guy for a couple years. We see absolutely no loading down here, the wrist link. That club is just accelerating way faster than the arm the entire time. So if we're looking at how do we read the power? Power in this golfer is coming from the core link. Their biggest opportunity for increasing their speed would absolutely be tackling that wrist link. And even looking at this, I think if we started to tackle that, we could get significantly better peak speed sequence, so probably multiple benefits with a single intervention right there. Now let's go ahead, let's take a look at our third golfer. Now we've got our third golfer up. If you remember, this is a good player. He's actually our club champion here at King Valley a couple years ago. But, it was for a former professional hockey player, driver maxes out around 230. Massive opportunity for speed. So let's get into the transition sequence here and take a look at segmental loading. So we're going to get in here just like always. Let's get rid of the arm. Let's get rid of the club. And yeah, you know what? A perfect fanning pattern. So there is absolutely no core loading. There's no point in time where that pelvis is rotating faster towards the target than the upper body. So let's kill that. And let's go see if there's anything coming from the arm. Okay, all right, well, you know what? This is good. This explains where he gets a little bit of power. You can see here when this upper body goes first, we've got, while it doesn't happen for a long time, there's a fair bit of area in here. So that power they do get is coming from the shoulder link, not the core link. Now the last thing, let's take a look and see if they're getting anything out of the wrist. Gosh, again, just barely right at the top of the backswing. There's a tiny bit of loading there, and then we can see it quickly moves into fanning where that club is accelerating very rapidly. So if I was going to be tackling adding more speed with this player, certainly I'm going to be looking at transition sequence, and I see the biggest opportunity in the core link, and I see that because there's just flat out nothing there. There's also a fairly significant opportunity to get some right here out of the wrist link, but they've already got a little bit there, so I would tackle the low-hanging fruit first, go for that core link, and we'll be able to help them significantly increase speed. Hopefully taking a look at these live examples gives you an idea of how you can read segmental loading in the transition sequence and use it as a mechanism to identify injury risk, where the power is coming from, and where their opportunities are to generate more power. The last portion of kinematic sequence that we analyze here at the lab is the deceleration pattern. And when we say pattern, we're talking about the shape of the curves, and when we say sequence, we're talking about order of operation. So let's take a look here at our first golfer. When we get in here, we see quite steep deceleration pattern, and to us that's a descriptor of efficient energy transfer. When that one segment goes through a rapid deceleration, especially right here when we look at the arm where it's very smooth, it's a very stable segment, which is going to give us maximum energy transfer onto the next one. If we take a look in here at the pelvis, however, you can see how it's not quite as smooth a curve, it's not quite as steep a curve. So from that we can infer that there's some lower body instability, which is going to make it a little bit more difficult for those distal segments to fire in balance. In fact, if we take a look a little bit here prior to the peak speed, we can see as soon as these three distal segments fire, we do see a flattening of that curve, destabilization of the rotation. So we see it a little before, we see it a little after. Definitely work on lower body stability would have a positive ripple effect up through that entire chain of events. We see that same pattern. It's more stable here in the decel pattern in the upper body, but we do see a little instability moving in, and that arm looks great. So all in all, again here, really good, and that's reflected by this player they flush it and they get to play about 4 times a year. So that's a great one to model after. But now let's go and take a look at our second golfer. Now, if you remember, our second golfer here is the one that really kind of struggles with, with their general consistency. When they do hit the ball, they hit it quite well. So if we get in over here and look, this decel pattern, gosh, there's a lot going on there. So the first thing I take a look at, even though peak speed's out of sequence, the arm tries to stabilize first, but it just flat out can't do it. Right? It's trying to stabilize to let things go off of it, but then with the late stabilization of the pelvis, it gets pulled back into rapid acceleration. And when we look at these two segments right here, not just in this particular swing, but as we flip through and look at the general inconsistency, a lot of that I feel has to do with the general instability of the pelvis. This would be kind of what we would call flatlining, where it tries to stabilize and let the rest of the body fire over top of it, but it just kind of keeps drifting. To me, this is kind of like trying to shoot a cannon out of a canoe. It's not very easy to do. So definitely, starting to work on some tightrope drills, getting them involved with a TPI exercise program to increase the stability is going to do nothing but add positive benefits when you see this type of decel pattern. Now let's go and take a look at our last golfer. We've got our last golfer up here, and if you remember, this player hit it very short, but you know, they've got great timing, former professional athlete, and let's take a look at their decel pattern and see if we can figure out how they make this work. You know, so first thing when we get in here, you know, we can see in this swing they're, you know, a little more out of sequence than they normally are. As that upper body starts to decelerate here, it kind of, again, it sort of levels off, right? So that's where we see some instability up here in the arm. Not too bad with the pelvis here. It's relatively smooth, and we've got a decent bit of decel, which, as I read this, you know, really gives it a stable base for this arm to fire up here. And when I look at the decel pattern of the arm, to me, that's phenomenal. So they're able, you know, to just hold it together with the lower body to give themselves a stable base to fire that arm. And that is, you know, that's so clean to me that that's a real descriptor of how they manage to square that club face up every time, even if it's not with a ton of speed. Now, we just shared with you our entire process for decoding kinematic sequence. We start with transition. If you remember, that's what, you know, really has the most common traits amongst elite play. From transition sequence, we go into that peak speed or deceleration sequence. That's where we start to understand how that golfer gets the power out that they put into transition. How do they release energy out to the club head? Once we've looked at that, we're going to go back into the segmental loading, and we want to see, you know, first off, do they have any injury risk? None of the players we looked at today really overloaded a segment, but when you see that, it'll really jump out at you. We also want to see in there, where does the power come from, and where do they have opportunities to generate more power? And our last step is going to be looking at that deceleration pattern, or how well do they stabilize each body segment to allow the more distal ones to fire, giving them an opportunity to consistently square the face. Hopefully this has been helpful for you. You know, we think if you follow this same process, you're going to start to be able to deliver a more consistent diagnosis to your player and have more effective interventions that help them get better faster.